One of the members of the Wisconsin Elections Commission had pictures of her home posted on social media and received threatening messages about her children. Even elected officials are attacking the role of these individuals in administering our elections. A Republican sheriff has called for the 5 members of the bipartisan Wisconsin Election Commission to face criminal charges for guidance they provided during the pandemic about collecting absentee ballots from nursing homes. Madam President, let's be clear. On January 6th, 2021, Donald Trump not only incited a violent insurrection against our democracy, he also incited an ongoing attack on voting rights across America. Across the country, we've seen more than 400 bills that restrict access to voting that have been introduced in 49 states. In Wisconsin, the Republican-controlled state legislature has advanced legislation curtailing voting rights and putting up barriers to make it harder to vote. Last year, they passed measures that would make it harder for voters to turn in their absentee ballots. They have passed legislation that threatens election officials with felonies for assisting voters with minor issues on their ballots. And they want to make it harder for people with disabilities who cannot make it into the polls to exercise their right to vote. Thankfully, our Wisconsin governor has vetoed these measures. Despite Dropbox being a safe, secure, and effective way for voters to turn in their ballots and have their votes counted, and despite previous support for their use from Republicans in the state legislature, Trump's big lie has pushed them to now oppose the use of Dropboxes statewide. In fact, there is now a push to override guidance from the Wisconsin Elections Commission to make Dropboxes for legal ballots illegal in Wisconsin. At the same time, the Republicans in the state legislature are advancing a redistricting proposal that will double down on Wisconsin's unprecedented level of hyper-partisan gerrymandering, where politicians pick their voters instead of people choosing their elected officials. Not to be outdone, the New York Times has reported that my fellow senator from Wisconsin, quote, and this is a quote, believes Democrats cheat. This false accusation was accompanied by a proposal from this U.S. senator to change the rules in Wisconsin and have the Republican-controlled legislature seize control over the administration of our elections, taking this nonpartisan process out of the hands of our bipartisan independent Wisconsin State Elections Commission. As was reported, quote, Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican, said that GOP state lawmakers should unilaterally assert control over federal elections, claiming that they had the authority to do so even if Governor Tony Evers, a Democrat, stood in their way. An extraordinary legal argument debunked by a 1932 Supreme Court decision and a 1964 ruling from the Wisconsin Supreme Court, end quote, from the New York Times. For my part, I believe voting rights are fundamental to our democracy, and that is why I will keep on working to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, so we stop voter suppression efforts and protect the right to vote. We must ensure that regardless of where you live in this country, you have the same access to the ballot box and faith that our elections are fair and safe. I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. My Democratic colleagues are continuing what started last week with spending hours trying to convince members of their own party, both here in this chamber and across the country, that they had no choice but to blow up the Senate rules by firing a partisan torpedo at the filibuster. Now it appears, from what we heard, that they used demeaning, shaming words and really went about weaving quite a frightening tale about what would happen if their Democratic colleagues did not cave on this issue. That tale was no more based in reality than the vile accusations of racism that they've hurled at those who oppose this push to single-party rule. Last week, when this insulting narrative started to collapse, they tried a new approach and pitched their assault on the Senate as a carve-out to accommodate an emergency change to election law. I fully believe when someone is going to tell you who they are, you should believe them. And over the past year, we have watched Joe Biden and the Democrats throw self-control out the window and leverage emergency after emergency to expand their power. Joe Biden signed more than a dozen executive orders in the very first hours of his presidency, knowing that if he did not do this, these policies would never see the light of day. The people, and that is the people of this country, hadn't seen fit to give his allies in Congress the majority that he needed for his agenda. So he waved his pen and conjured up a mandate for himself. And now his Democratic allies in the Senate are prepared to do the exact same thing on behalf of a bill that would federalize elections in America, stripping away protections for the ballot box and injecting uncertainty into the voting process. Now, who asked for this? No one. If the American people wanted this, they would have given the Democrats the majority they needed to get it done. But they didn't. And in fact, I hear from Tennesseans every day who want it to be easier to vote and harder to cheat, not the other way around. But based on what I've seen, I've come to the conclusion that what the people want no longer seems to matter to our Democratic colleagues. We can take today's event as proof that if the people don't see fit to give them the power, they will come and take that power and turn the Senate into a rubber stamp they can deploy when an executive order just won't get the job done. That really frightens Tennesseans because they can see what is coming down the path. Open borders, court packing, gun control, the Green New Deal, abortion on demand, socialized health care, speech restrictions, federalized election, and more out-of-control spending and, yes, higher inflation. We know that this is the future that the Democrats are laying out for America. It's the future that they see for our children and grandchildren because these policies are the policies that they have fought for since long before Joe Biden took office. Do we really think that this attack on the Senate rules will stop with an election law takeover? The American people don't think it will. Tennesseans do not think that it will. As I said, when somebody shows you who they really are, you ought to believe them. And as I've said previously, this is no way to run the world's greatest deliberative body. But this is exactly how the Democrats are choosing to go about trying to destroy it. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Delaware.
Madam President, why are we here? Why is this Senate dedicating this entire day to a debate on the floor? Well, we are here today to debate and consider two critical voting rights bills. It's our fourth try. It's our fourth try The 3 previous times we have tried to get on this bill, there's been a filibuster on the motion to proceed, an obscure procedural standing that prevented us from getting to this bill. We are finally on it. And there is a challenge in this chamber and this country to explain and articulate briefly why this is such an important moment and why it justifies in a tension between 2 of my core principles, one of which is making sure that we work across the aisle and find bipartisan solutions as much as possible, and the other that we protect foundational principles, the right to vote, and through that right to make progress towards justice and inclusion in our society, that I choose the latter. We have seen, Madam President, across our country in recent months and years, ever since Shelby County, a Supreme Court case, blew a hole in the center of the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, the most powerful civil rights law in the history of our country, a whole series of laws at the state and local level eroding and undermining access to the ballot. And in the months since the 2020 election, tragically, we've also seen now state legislatures take up and pass laws designed to change who counts the ballot, who certifies an election. Voter suppression and voter subversion, access to the ballot box, and who counts the votes. Every one of us is here because we were elected. Every one of us wants to know, or should want to know, that we want a free and fair election in which as many Americans in our state as possible voted. Why would we want barriers to Americans with disabilities, Americans speaking different languages, Americans working full-time and strained by their work and family commitments, Americans who are Black or brown, Native American or Hispanic or African American? Why would we want to have any suspicion that our election to this body relied in some part on suppressing or miscounting those votes? Madam President, today I'm going to speak just briefly, if I can, about how today is really about a frayed bipartisan consensus. Some of my Republican friends and colleagues have spoken about how we have to continue to hang on to and respect the rules of this Senate, especially the 60-vote threshold, to moving forward on policy changes. And I've long defended that and respect that concern. But we are also principally here because of a forgotten consensus about working together to protect access to the ballot box. We've heard just now from a colleague the accusation that this is a partisan federal takeover of elections. Yet several of my colleagues have read and reminded us the Constitution itself explicitly gives this Congress the power, even the responsibility, to ensure that federal elections are conducted in a way that is free and fair. When the first Senate gathered, think about who was in the room. Think about the qualifications to vote, how narrow they were. Propertied white men. Think about the arc of change in our nation and how year after year, generation after generation, with a huge amount of struggle, ultimately the moral question of who can vote, of who counts and whose vote should be counted, has slowly, painfully, through sacrifice, changed. There was for 50 years, from 1965, when earned through blood and sacrifice on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law by a former senator from Texas, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. There was for 50 years a consensus in this body that the Voting Rights Act was a critical, even a sacrosanct protection. It was reauthorized 5 times. In 1970, in 1975, in 1982, in 1992, by strong bipartisan majorities, and in 2006, unanimously. No wonder then that my friend and predecessor at this desk, our president, seems to struggle to comprehend how a Republican Party that included Strom Thurmond, when he chaired the Judiciary Committee, our immediate past president. But a widespread belief that voter fraud was undermining the very credibility of our elections has been adopted across our country and spread and caused a fundamental break. There's also been action by the new conservative majority on the Supreme Court, first in 2013 in Shelby County, where they took out the Section 4B formula that then eviscerated Section 5 pre-clearance to provide pre-election protection against voter suppression. And then just last year, Brnovich versus DNC, when 6 conservative justices concluded that a state law in Arizona that had a demonstrable disparate impact on Hispanic and Native American and black voters could be allowed to stay on the books and proceed. Now, let's be clear. We should make sure there is no widespread voter fraud. And on the Judiciary Committee, my colleague from Illinois and others have led hearings to confirm that there is no widespread voter fraud, as my colleague from California, the former Secretary of State, spoke eloquently to earlier. And the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the other bill in front of us, benefited from modifications by Senator Manchin of West Virginia, also a former Secretary of State, to ensure that we have protections in terms of voter ID. I will also briefly, and I know I need to conclude, respond, if I can, to accusations by several of my colleagues that Delaware's voting laws are not yet at the highest standard. And I will say, it is true. My state has a long, brutal, tragic history of race relations that were not their best, and our voting laws have just now come to be up to the federal standards. We are hoping to make the standard for our whole country. But let me ask this question. In the midst of a pandemic, when state after state has adopted changes to voting ballot boxes and no-fault vote by mail and same-day registration, why would states be moving those back? The pandemic isn't over. In November, millions of medically vulnerable Americans will be looking to vote. Why would we end these new provisions to provide access to the ballot box? Let me make 2 last points and conclude. As I've traveled to a dozen countries in the last year, I've heard from allies and adversaries concerns about the health of our democracy. We must take action to protect the right to vote in this country. And last, we should not make the last casualty of this dread pandemic rolling back voting access. If I must choose between a fundamental principle learned through 5 congressional civil rights pilgrimages spent with John Lewis, that voting is a moral question, and continue to hold to a rule, I will choose the former and embrace a change that is as narrow and temporary as possible and that will restore debate on this floor. As I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the last time with John Lewis, he stopped and turned and said to all of us, in his halting voice, knowing he was in his last weeks, never give in, never give up, never become hostile. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Stay hopeful and keep marching. It is my hope, Madam President, that our debate today, our votes today, will give strength and lift and truth to the service and the life and the sacrifice of Congressman Lewis. Thank you.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Florida.
Madam President, like many of my colleagues, I often speak about my family here on the Senate floor. As most of my colleagues know, I grew up poor and spent years of my childhood living in public housing. I never knew my biological dad, and my mom and my adopted father did the best they could for our family with the very little they had. I think that a small part of my life is well known, but what may not be known to many people is that my parents were Democrats. Sadly, the Democrat Party my parents belonged to no longer exists. Today's Democrat Party would be totally unrecognizable to my parents, just as it is to millions of Americans all across our country right now. I am a proud Republican, and it's no secret I'm trying to expand my party, but I still believe in the benefits of our centuries-old two-party system. It makes our nation stronger, pushes us to listen to both sides, work together, and leads to progress. That's why the filibuster is so important. As a rule, the filibuster embodies what is most essential to the survival of our republic. It weakens the sometimes attractive nature of tribalism and bolsters the importance of and need for consensus when crafting policy. The filibuster protects our democratic process. That's why the founders designed the Senate to operate this way, as a cooling saucer that could resist the temptation of political expediency that leads our country to wild swings in policy and position. I make this point not only to highlight the foolishness of doing away with this rule as my Democrat colleagues would like to do, but to draw attention to the gravely concerning abandonment of democratic principles we see in today's Democratic Party. Madam President, I take no joy in saying this, but today's Democrat Party has become the new anti-democracy party. The terrifying examples of this are all around us: packing the Supreme Court, pushing a radical federal takeover of state elections, ignoring our laws on border enforcement and criminal prosecution, enforcing unconstitutional vaccine mandates on American workers. None of these things give more power to the people we are elected to represent. What these dangerous ideas show is that today's Democrats don't believe the people are capable of getting it right. Democrats don't think their ideas can win enough elections to control a majority in the Senate. Senator Schumer said as much just last week. He said that if the Democrats don't pass their Corrupt Politicians Act, they will lose their majority. A party that once prided itself on being a voice for working Americans like my parents is now turning to authoritarian tactics to impose its will on government by force because it does not trust the decision voters will make. In trying to pack the Supreme Court, Democrats are saying they do not trust the decisions of state legislatures, bodies comprised of the people's elected representatives. In pushing the federal takeover of state elections, Democrats are showing that they know their ideas are too radical to win the approval of voters, so they need to leave the back door open for fraud and the dilution of votes to win elections and stay in power. That's why they want to give non-citizens, those here illegally and who may be dangerous criminals, the sacred right to vote. In pushing an unconstitutional vaccine mandate, Democrats are making clear that they don't trust the American people to make smart decisions for themselves and their families when it comes to their own health. In the eyes of today's Democrat leaders, this agreement is intolerable. There are no more opponents, only racist. They allow no room for compromise because all who disagree are evil, bigoted, and backward. When the ruling class strips the people of their voice, democracy dies. When the elites in Washington decide they know better than the families they're supposed to represent, our American experience fails. Madam President, it is a sad day when I think about how unrecognizable today's Democrat Party would be to my parents. Not because it has naturally evolved or modernized, but because it's abandoned the principles it once fought so hard to protect. I'm sure these words will upset many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I hope they do, and I hope it drives them to refocus their party back where it belongs, on the needs of American families. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senior senator from Michigan.
I'm not sure where to start, having just heard my colleague from Florida. I just have to say that who he is describing, I don't recognize either, because I don't recognize that at all of anyone that is here. And I just want to start by thanking my Democratic colleagues, first of all, for voting for the American Recovery Act, that, among many other things, is helping to focus on ways to bring down the cost of food and our food supply chain to help fix it, and a number of other issues that, unfortunately, one colleague on the Republican side voted for, not one. So we've heard a lot today about how we should be focusing on the needs of the American people. I think there'd be a collective amen from our side about that. And we would love to have our colleagues join us, frankly, in that effort. But nothing's more fundamental to our democracy than preserving our freedom to vote as Americans, and that's really what the debate and the votes are all about today. We know there are people willing to use violence to stop accurate, legal certifications of our national presidential election. And how do we know this? Because we were here. We were here a year ago on January 6th and witnessed the violence and the death and the destruction. We also know there's a coordinated Republican effort across the country to limit, make it easier to intimidate and remove election officials who won't do their bidding. And how do I know this? Because it's happening in Michigan as I speak. Today's vote on the legislation in front of us is the fundamental act we must do to stop this destructive partisan movement. And we also know that in order to make this happen, we have to return the Senate to its original principle of majority vote. Our nation's founders had a lot of opinions about the type of country we should be and, the type of government we should have. And at times, the discussions got heated, and not just because it was summer in Philadelphia, Senator Casey, but they were actually wearing wool at the time, and so it got heated in a number of different ways. However, there was one thing they agreed on. Government should be run by the will of the majority, not a minority, not a king. They agreed on this because they saw what happened when a nation is held captive to the views of the minority. The very first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, was frankly a dysfunctional mess. That's why they gathered in Philadelphia to try again and to get it right this time. And getting it right meant majority rule. James Madison said that the majority rule was fundamental to our democracy. Thomas Jefferson said that the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail. And in Federalist 22, Alexander Hamilton wrote a lengthy description of the problems that arise when a minority can override the will of the majority. The founders didn't have an opinion on the Senate filibuster because it didn't exist. It didn't exist. However, over time, senators figured out they could slow down legislation through unlimited debate. And we know that at first the filibuster was rarely used, mainly by Southern senators who wanted to block civil rights legislation. Yet over time, it's evolved from a procedural tool into a weapon, and we all know this. And this weapon is increasingly used to stop our nation from making progress on issues that are so important to the American people, so important to our families, and crucial to the future of our country. We're here today because the most basic freedom in our democracy is the freedom to vote. And across the nation, Republicans are pushing legislation to take that away, including in Michigan. In 2020, Michigan voters clearly and resoundingly chose Joe Biden to be our president and Kamala Harris to be our vice president in the largest voter turnout in our nation's history. They won by more than 150,000 votes, and that's 14 times more than Donald Trump's margin was in 2016. Now, I very much appreciate my friend Senator Thune saying he accepted his first loss to the Senate. None of us like to lose. It's not fun. But President Trump should have done the same thing. But instead, Donald Trump's campaign and his allies filed 8 lawsuits in Michigan, lost every single one of them. And in the only case that was appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court, the court declined to hear the case despite having a majority of Republican justices. The people of Michigan voted. Michigan Republicans and Democratic counties verified the vote. And our state, on a bipartisan vote, certified it. And there is no evidence of fraud that would suggest we need legislation to now restrict our voting. So why are Michigan Republicans trying to make it harder to vote with 39 different bills that they've introduced? Well, they just don't like who Michiganders voted for. Think about it. Because they didn't like the result, Michigan Republicans decided to target Michigan voters. As part of a coordinated nationwide assault on this fundamental right that my friend, the late Congressman John Lewis, called precious, almost sacred. That's why we must pass the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act today. I know that some folks think that any legislation we pass to protect the freedom to vote must be bipartisan to be legitimate. But when it's time to vote, we're told not one Republican will join all 50 Democrats. 50 Democrats in voting for the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Therefore, they say the bill shouldn't pass. Yet the attacks on democracy in Michigan and the other states are strictly partisan. In Michigan, Republicans are even using a loophole in our Constitution to go around the governor's veto and take away people's freedom to vote without her capacity to veto the legislation. And they're doing it by a simple majority. And they're doing it with not one Democratic vote, not one in Michigan. But they're still doing it. Republicans are making it harder for people to vote using a simple majority, yet we are told that protecting people's freedom to vote needs a super majority to do it. That makes no sense. And wait, I think I hear Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison rolling over in their graves. Today, we each will choose to protect every American's freedom to vote, or allow those supporting the big lie to limit people's freedoms and undermine our democracy. And today, we will choose to stand with our founders and our Constitution as written, or maintain Senate procedures that are seriously broken. It's time to restore the Senate to majority rule as it was intended by the founders, so we can protect the American people's right to vote. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Kansas.
Madam President, as everyone in this chamber knows, the filibuster requires a supermajority, 60 votes to proceed on most issues in the Senate. The filibuster is truly the essence of this deliberative body. It's what makes the Senate the Senate. It's what forces collaboration, long-term solution, and prevents a partisan roller coaster ride of ever-changing laws and rules every 2 years. The filibuster puts the brakes on hasty legislation and helps prevent unintended consequences, which comes with most every new law. I ask America this: do you want more laws or less laws? Do we want more certainty from our government or less certainty? Arguably, the best speeches to keep the filibuster in place have been made by presidents and senators from across the aisle. Nothing is more convincing than my Democrat friends' own words. President Obama, then Senator Obama, said in a floor speech here in 2005, and I quote, "But the American people sent us here to be their voice. They understand that those voices can at times become loud and argumentative, but they also hope we can disagree without being disagreeable. And at the end of the day, they expect both parties to work together to get the people's business done. What they do not expect is for one party, be it Republican or Democrat, to change the rules in the middle of the game so they can make all the decisions while the other party is told to sit down and keep quiet." And I'm still quoting President Obama here: "The American people want less partisanship in this town, but everyone in this chamber knows that if the majority chooses to end the filibuster, if they choose to change the rules and put an end to democratic debate, then the fighting, the bitterness, and the gridlock will only get worse." And I end quoting President Obama. And in that same year, our current majority leader stated from this very floor, and I quote the majority leader again: "We are on the precipice of a crisis, a constitutional crisis. The checks and balances which have been at the core of this republic are about to be evaporated by the nuclear option. The checks and balances which say if you get 51% of the vote, you do not get your way 100% of the time. It's amazing. It's almost a temper tantrum by those on the hard right." And again, still quoting the majority leader, the current majority leader, "That is not becoming of the leadership of the Republican side of the aisle, nor is it becoming of this republic. That is what we call abuse of power." And I end quoting the majority leader. If the current Democrat majority party jams us through, they will live to rue the day, possibly as soon as next year. But for now, my colleagues across the aisle are kowtowing to the radical left base. The tail is wagging the proverbial dog. Sadly, 25 of my colleagues across the aisle have flip-flopped from a position they staked out in writing just 4 years ago. But thank goodness that one senator who signed the letter has remained true to his word. What has happened to change the mind of these 25 senators? Why is the national media not asking them the same question? Because it would point out the hypocrisy. Let me remind them all, as President Joe Biden once stated to this body, that removing the 60-vote threshold would, and I again quote, again from President Biden, quite frankly, it is the ultimate act of unfairness to alter the unique responsibility of the Senate, and to do so by breaking the very rules of the Senate. But simply, the nuclear option would transform the Senate from the so-called cooling saucer of our founding fathers talked about to cool the passions of the day to a pure majoritarian body like Parliament. But the Senate is not meant to be a place of pure majoritism. At its core, the filibuster is not about stopping a nominee or a bill. It's about compromise and moderation. And again, I end that quote of President Biden. These men and women of noble character, in their heart of hearts, do they truly believe in making this rule change that will forever alter the way our government functions, the way our founding fathers intended it to be? What will they say to the people of their state when the shoe's on the other foot, when Republicans hold the majority in the Senate once again, and Republicans show them how the hog eats the cabbage? I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Senator from New Jersey. Mr. President, I come to the floor today in defense of what in essence is the very essence of our democracy and the voting rights of all Americans. Our dear friend, someone who I had the privilege of serving with in the House of Representatives, the late John Lewis, took a beating on a bridge in Selma for the right to vote. Surely we in the Senate can muster a shred of his courage to protect that right. There are no other rights without the right to vote. It is through the right to vote that freedom rings, that justice reigns, and opportunity arises. As we all know, this Monday was Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and we remember his words. He said, quote, "The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by human beings for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison people because they are different from others." That's what he called the right to vote, humanity's greatest instrument for advancing progress. Well, the time has come for us to defend it. Now, my colleagues who oppose our voting rights legislation have had ample time to make their opinions heard. Soon it will be time to end debate and hold a simple up or down vote on the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Advancement Act. After all, the state legislatures passing voter suppression laws across the country are doing so with simple majorities. Conservative majorities that in many cases were born out of decades of partisan gerrymandering. And how about the Supreme Court? It was a simple majority vote of 5-4 that gutted the Voting Rights Act. That was the law that John Lewis and others risked their lives for on Bloody Sunday. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended discriminatory tactics that not only blocked black voters from their ballots, but other minorities too, including Latinos. Shortly after the Civil War, Latinos held greater political power in states like California, Texas, Arizona. But as Jim Crow spread throughout the South, they were pushed out of elected positions and threatened with violence for their continued participation. The Voting Rights Act transformed our country for the better. It created the diverse, multiracial democracy we live in today. And I know that my story, the son of first-generation refugees who came from nothing and rose to become one of 100 United States senators in a nation of 350 million people, is only possible because of the civil rights giants who came before me. The Voting Rights Act ended Jim Crow-era voting laws, and its preclearance provision stopped states from resurrecting them in the future. States and localities with ugly histories of discrimination had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before tampering with their voting laws. Yet in 2013, the Supreme Court's 5-4 ruling in Shelby County essentially said that racial progress rendered the need for this oversight obsolete. Obsolete. As if racism no longer exists in this country. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said it best. She said, ending preclearance when it is continuing to, quote, stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Indeed, that ruling opened the floodgates for new voter suppression laws. My colleague from New Jersey often cited Texas. Texas, home to millions of Black and Latino voters, resurrected a strict photo ID law that had been struck down just the year before. Then North Carolina slashed early voting and ended same-day registration with a law that the Fourth Circuit found was, quote, intentionally written to disenfranchise Black voters. And other states like Alabama started reducing polling locations in minority communities. These measures may not look like poll taxes or literacy tests, but they are the tools of just the same. Their intent is the same, to depress turnout among minority voters, and they threaten the promise of our vibrant multiracial democracy. Now, throughout this debate, I've tried to sit here several hours. I've heard our Republican colleagues question, well, why after record turnouts in the last presidential election would we feel the need to revisit voting rights legislation? Well, the answer is pretty simple. If Republicans systematically were not tearing down the laws that gave rise to the record turnouts, then maybe this wouldn't be necessary. But that's exactly what they have done in state after state. Voting rights used to enjoy broad bipartisan support here in the Senate. Indeed, Republicans and Democrats stood together for decades to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, most recently in 2006. In fact, I want to quote one of my colleagues on the day of the last reauthorization. He said, quote, America's history is a story of ever-increasing freedom, hope, and opportunity for all. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 represents one of this country's greatest steps forward in that story. Every American must have freedom of political expression, including the free, unfettered right to vote, close quote. Those words were Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who spoke those words on that day. He was one of 16 Republicans who proudly voted for the 2006 reauthorization, but stand in the way today. 16 Republicans who still are present in the United States Senate, including not only he, but Senators Grassley, Shelby, Crapo, Collins, Burr, Inhofe, Graham, Thune, Cornyn, Blackburn, Blunt, Boozman, Capito, Moran, and Wicker. That's right. 16 Republicans who supported the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act still serve in this body today. So to them I say, join us. Join us. What's changed? What was right then is clearly right now. Join us, and we could pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act with a bipartisan supermajority, no change of the rules necessary. Just join us as you did in 2006. But we know that won't happen. Not today, not since our democracy has been flooded by a torrential downpour of lies. Earlier this month, we observed the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. A defeated president's violent mob nearly overturned a free and verifiably fair election and tried to overthrow the U.S. Constitution. Shots rang out in the Capitol. The Confederate flag waved through its hallowed halls. That never even happened during the Civil War. a New Jerseyan and Capitol police officer named Brian Sicknick was drenched in bear spray and later died. Imagine using a toxic substance intended to fend off bear attacks on a fellow human beings, beating officers within inches of death, inflicting such painful trauma that multiple officers have since ended their own lives, all because one man could not accept defeat. A man with an ego so big, he could not fathom losing by 7 million votes. An ego so big, he manufactured a lie to match it. A lie so big, it inspired violence and nearly brought down the Constitution. That lie should have died within minutes of the former president speaking it. Instead, it lived. The big lie lived to grow even bigger, thanks to a Republican Party that is no longer a party, I believe, of principle, but a party of fealty to a wannabe despot. Since the insurrection, the most anti-democratic laws since Jim Crow have taken the nation by storm. Last year, 19 states passed nearly 36 laws undermining access to the ballot box. It is as if they're trying to codify the big lie into law. In Arizona, Georgia, and other states, they've made it harder to vote by mail, something that my colleagues have talked about, that Americans have been doing for decades, and the Republican GOP efforts one time long embraced it as a way to succeed. They're also removing drop boxes in minority communities under the bogus claim that they invite fraud. So when it's in Reverend Warnock's community, or Senator Padilla's community, or Cory Booker's community, or my community, somehow that drop box invites fraud just simply because it's in our community? Another lie straight from the mouth of a defeated president. And many states are reducing early voting days. When you add up all these restrictions, what do you get? Longer lines at the polls, people giving up, folks who have to get home to their kids, workers who can't afford to take a day off. To the partisan architects of these laws, their sighs of resignation, that's music to their ears. They want to make voting so inconvenient for working people and communities of color that they don't even bother. The Georgia state legislature gave itself the power to remove election officials that were elected by the people if they don't like what they see. Simply put, these laws gave state legislators new tools to disregard the will of the voters. So I've come to the conclusion that since Republicans cannot win elections with the power of their ideas, they're doing everything they can to change the rules of the game so they can win anyway. In doing so, they are taking us back to a time and place where injustice prevailed, a time and a place that I certainly don't want to go back to, nor do I want my children or grandchildren to go back to, or those who I represent to go back to. Finally, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I would note that when we see an attempted coup or creeping authoritarianism abroad, we call it democratic backsliding. Now, other countries are wondering, is that happening to the United States? Dictators around the world are jumping for joy. This is what they want to see: democracy in disarray. In fact, last November, the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance added the United States to a list of backsliding democracies for the first time ever. Look, democratic self-government only works when all parties consent to be governed by whoever wins the most votes. That's how elections work. We can debate the corporate tax rate, we can disagree about financial aid funding, we can differ over health care policy, but the outcome of a fair and free election, the sanctity of the right to vote, these are not up for debate. Voting rights are the foundation of this entire democratic enterprise, this great American experiment. It's time every senator looks into their soul and decides how they want to be remembered when future generations remember this perilous moment in our history. This legislation will protect the rights of all of our voters, young and old, rich and poor, black and white, Latino and Asian, indigenous, immigrant, Republican, Democrat, independent, the single mom, exhausted but relieved her neighbor could watch the kids so she could make it to the polls, the warehouse worker who can't afford a day off but winds up taking one anyway, the elderly African-American woman, her hands shaking with determination as she signs her name on a mail-in ballot. She remembers life before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and she will never forget the sacrifices of those who marched for it, who bled for it, and even died for the right to vote. Now, I'll just say, the final thing, we all take an oath to the Constitution. It's required under the Constitution to be sworn in as a member of Congress. And in that Constitution, an amendment that is seen only as it relates to a different time in history, but is very clear and very powerful. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. These rights enshrined in the Constitution under the 15th Amendment, they are certainly being abridged. They are certainly being affected in a way that we could not fathom in the year 2022. How shameful it would be if we let it slip through our fingers and be buried under an avalanche of one sore loser's lies. How shameful it would be to violate our oath to the Constitution, to that 15th Amendment, in order to preserve some rule that is not in the Constitution and certainly is not as enshrined as that right to vote. I hope that those who joined us in 2006 will be there today to vote with us on the Republican side. And if that fails, then I hope we will change the filibuster into a talking filibuster so the nation can see who stands on the side of ensuring the franchise of that right to vote for every American. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, something I've been hearing a lot lately from members of the media, from many of my Democrat colleagues here in the Senate, and even from the President of the United States, is that democracy is at stake. That democracy will die if we don't make drastic changes to our election system. That we are just one election away from the end of the experiment our founders began in 1776. If my colleagues really believe that our democracy is teetering on the edge of a cliff, that it's going to fall over the edge unless we transform the way we run elections across the entire country, then they need to be able to tell the American people why. But instead, all I'm hearing from Democrats, even from the president himself, is that democracy is on its deathbed, that Americans are no better than George Wallace or Jefferson Davis if they dare to question that, and that the only solution is for one party to rewrite the rules of the United States Senate to pass a completely partisan federal takeover of state and local elections. Those are truly some wild claims. If you take these assertions at face value, I can see why some Americans might be concerned about the state of voting rights in this country. But not a word of what they're saying is true. The good news, Mr. President, is that most people live in the real world, where America shattered records for voter turnout in the 2020 election. 66% of eligible voters cast a ballot, the highest level in 120 years. That translates to 156 million Americans, the most in history. In my state of Nebraska, 76% of voters cast a ballot in the last election. We've been proud to be a no-excuse state for absentee voting for years, since long before the pandemic. We have that law because we want to make it easier for Nebraskans to vote. And there are many other states that don't require voters to provide a reason before voting by mail, not just Nebraska. Across the country, turnout was up in the last election, regardless of race, class, or any other demographic. And according to Pew Research, 94% of 2020 voters, they said voting was easy. Yet Democrats still say that voter suppression is rampant in the United States. The logical response to that is to ask, okay, where? In Georgia, Democrats say. After Georgia passed a new law last year, things have apparently gotten so bad that the president picked Atlanta to give a recent speech